Welcome back, everybody, to Dungeon Brew. Today, John and I are continuing our conversation on Strongholds. Today, we're talking about Clerics. Stay tuned.
Welcome to Dungeon Brew.
Welcome back, everybody, to Dungeon Brew. Today, John and I are talking about Cleric Strongholds. We started this conversation a couple of weeks ago, looking at barbarians, looking at bards. Now we're going to look at some religious strongholds, starting with the clerics. John, why don't you start us off in this conversation? What's important to consider when you're looking at the cleric?
So I think cleric strongholds are super interesting simply because clerics as a class get access to a domain, and the domain is something that can really inform the way that the stronghold takes shape. So there's such a wide variety of domains, and they continue to expand these, that you really can get away with just about anything. If you think about a war domain cleric, you're probably going to end up with a more militaristic style stronghold potentially, or at least a religious stronghold that has very strong militaristic overtones. Whereas if you have something like a trickery domain cleric, they may be closer to a thieves guild, or they might just be something that's kind of bizarre. And then you have, a life cleric, which might be more traditional. It might be a stronghold that focuses on things like having infirmaries and having residences for healing and safety and reprieve and that type of stuff. So the variety of strongholds that comes in for domain style clerics that have, that long list, you can get away with just about anything.
And I think the really interesting thing about a cleric stronghold that separates it from possibly other strongholds is it seems to always have an important part to play in the region it exists.
Right.
Because you have surrounding cities or surrounding villages or someone that's going to be impacted by either the dogma that they're preaching, or they need access to maybe a place to bury their dead, or they need some sort of medicine or assistance with, a disease that's taking, that, maybe overcoming the lands. So there's always like this connection to the people and the land that exists, where you may have some other ones that are a little bit more, I don't know. I think of a barbarian stronghold. You're not just going to go visit there for a good time. You're not going to just go walking through and see what's going on. But a cleric stronghold, like there always seems to be like a purpose of why you may have outside people coming through, which means that you are going to consider maybe, like you said, residences, healing areas, graveyards, things that are going to bring some sort of service back to the region that it exists within.
I just got to say, you've never been to a barbarian meat hall if you don't. If you think that you can't go to a barbarian stronghold for a good time. But, yeah, I agree. I think that the religious stronghold from a cleric perspective potentially could be a very positive influence on the surrounding region. It could be founded on something like a holy site of some kind, where, this is the first place that it could have significance to the religion in general. Mm-hmm. That was recovered by the cleric, and that's why they chose to set up a stronghold there. It could be a place of personal religious significance, the first place that they had an encounter with their god, or it could be the kind of place where this is the first time that they experience the benefit of the divine intervention, which is a class feature for the cleric, and the deity chose to actually extend their aid to the cleric in a meaningful way. All of those make important distinctions for the cleric in a place that they may choose to want to set up a stronghold. But you have to remember that clerics are not always good, so this could have very much the reverse effect, where you have an evil cleric setting up a place where, you come to bury your dead, they just don't stay buried. And that has a whole different, realm of options, really, for that type of stronghold, where you end up with this boat of undead, or this crypt, or, something along those lines. So it definitely has a different feel to it.
I'm trying to remember what campaign we played recently where I sent you guys into hell, and there was essentially that exact thing taking place where a temple had changed its devotion, and they had a graveyard that they were raising the dead from that you guys are having to deal with, but it was on the plane of hell. But yeah, it offers a lot of interesting features of what you can offer for your player characters specifically. I think it's important to make sure you sit down with the player character and know what they want to do with this stronghold, if they're going to be building it from scratch, so they have those options. Because oftentimes, depending on the nature of that domain and what the primary focus is for like their mannerisms or their beliefs is going to change what the aspects are. For instance, I'm thinking like if you have more of a pious cleric, you might have farms of them creating foods and creating goods and, you know, having to do menial work in some way to kind of build up those of their followers and the people they have at their stronghold. You may also be considering what type of heroes or people you want to have stationed at that stronghold with your player character to kind of influence or pull or direct the stronghold into a certain realm. So a lot of important features to think about. Is there things that you would do differently for an NPC in terms of how you want to present this for the characters? Any tips on that?
Yeah, but I think that there's something else I want to address real quick with the PC, which is that unlike some, probably more similar to fighters and some of the other classes we'll talk about later on, a cleric is generally associated with a faction more strongly than many other classes, which is whichever church they're allied with, which is usually just a representation of their god, but it could be a representation of their pantheon. So we keep talking about them finding or founding a stronghold in some location. Generally speaking, to found a stronghold for a religion, they probably need to get approval from their church. They may have to get approval from the local authorities. This isn't something where you can generally just walk into a region and suddenly go, okay, I'm founding a church right here, or whatever stronghold. And we kind of addressed this in the introductory video, but it's important to realize that religion is something that is a little bit contentious among some people, and they may not appreciate that the cleric decides to come into a region and found a church or found a stronghold that is a religion or deity that is in opposition to the rest of the religion that is in that region. Or even if it's allied with it, they may go, listen, we already have a church in that region. We don't need another one. Why don't you just, go somewhere else?
Come visit my shrine of Vecna.
Right. So I just want to point that out, that is something that you want to take consideration of when you're getting into founding a stronghold for a PC in a region, or if the PC has a particular interest in founding a stronghold. And this doesn't include even the conversation that we've also had before about recovering a stronghold. So we kind of talked about a holy site and a shrine or something along those lines. Maybe there's a lost temple, and that lost temple becomes the stronghold for the cleric because they go and recover it. They restore the sanctity of a lost temple of some kind and choose to set that up as their stronghold, which is also a possibility. So you can get really creative with that, with any number of existing type temple or dungeons that are always located in these old lost temples or whatever, corrupted temples, and the cleric comes in and cleanses it, sanctifies it, and allows it to be once again a representation of their deity.
Yeah, and then you have a visitation from the local governing officials to
see if they can apply for tax exempt status.
That's exactly right. Yeah, so in terms of the NPC, this has already kind of been established. It means that some of that red tape has already been crossed. If you're going to have this existing within those lands, you're not going to have to consider that so much, but you are going to want to make sure that it is somehow maybe in alliance with what's going on in that region if it's already in existence. I think it's probably safe to say.
Yeah. Yeah, and as far as NPCs go, I mean, oftentimes you have campaigns that sit around a NPC, particularly a quest giver that operates out of a church or some kind of holy site who is sending the PCs on various quests to do good or evil, depending on their alignment, but they're sent off into the region to do things. So it definitely makes sense that type of stronghold would exist in much higher frequency, maybe, or much more accessibility, most likely, than many other strongholds. Churches are generally seen as kind of a neutral ground or a safe ground in many regions. So you can have the party can go into almost any church and say, we're going to offer tithes, we want to speak with someone, and there's that openness that occurs in a religious stronghold that you don't necessarily see in a keep. The PCs just can't walk into a castle and say, hey, we're just going to hang out here. That's not generally acceptable, and it's even less acceptable in something like a Thieves Guild.
And I would also say when I think of NPC strongholds, because they oftentimes are a place for a quest giver to reside at, to hand things out to them. I really like not only, of course, looking at go out and do good or go out and do evil, but they oftentimes are a place that is going to hold religious relics, or send you out to go obtain particular relics or ancient pieces of their religion to bring back and hold there, because it brings them a certain level of prestige, which then brings in certain income, certain favor. And so that might be an interesting piece to look at. Not only when you're building a stronghold, what relics do they already have or what exists within there, but what might they be interested in sending your players out to go find throughout the region.
Yeah. So something else that I think is very interesting when it comes to NPCs, because you're talking about, where they would get sent out. When we did the campaign for Mystara a few years back, you guys went and discovered the Temple of Halav and explored that and that type of thing in the game that I ran. But the interesting thing about this is that the Church of Halav was located in Specularum, and you guys were operating out of Haven, I think was the name of the city, or the town. And the Church of Halav was up there, but the person who was following this was a patriarch of the church who was located in the town. But my point is there was this kind of interwoven, this web of connections that exists. And this kind of occurs within religion. This occurs within, and this is something that occurred in older editions, where there was this language of the church that was made popular by Gygax, where it's like you had an alignment language, is what he called it. But the idea was that if you were a member of the Catholic Church, for instance, then you would speak Latin, and Latin was the alignment language of the Catholic Church. In the same vein, if you were a member of the Church of Halav, you would have the alignment language of Halav, with whatever ancient language that would be, and you could speak in that with other people. Point I'm getting to here is, when it comes to NPC strongholds, this becomes part of that web. It becomes part of that connection that exists usually over the course of an entire region, particularly if it's a popular religion. And if you are connected with the stronghold that has that NPC, suddenly you're connected with lords and rulers and barons and all of these people who are affiliated with that church, because they all speak the same language of whatever that religion is, which makes it a very good hub to start out your questing and get your NPCs into any number of scenarios that exist all throughout that region. Sorry, there's a very long-winded explanation, but I think that it's important to realize that religion has this interconnectivity that doesn't necessarily exist in many other strongholds, and it's something you can capitalize on as a DM.
Yeah, and I think that makes it really enjoyable. I know we focus a lot on religion in our own campaigns. Religion and politics are constant themes in our campaigns, because they're oftentimes the two measures that control a populace and have the greatest influence on the population in the world that you're building. And so we spend a lot of time focusing on that. So knowing what that, as you're talking about, that interconnectivity looks like and what that influence looks like for your NPC strongholds is extremely important, so the players can really be immersed, because it should have a central piece in terms of how it's impacting many things that they're doing, even outside of that stronghold.
And really can start from like level 1 in terms of developing that and creating that and driving that narrative forward, so that by the time the PC actually gets their stronghold, they feel like they're a part of the church, so that when they go and say, I want permission to be able to found a stronghold or locate a stronghold or whatever, they have already been interacting with members of that church or members of that religious language for 10 levels or so, and they should have access to that.
So we've talked a little bit about having your characters build a stronghold from scratch, having your characters have maybe visiting an NPC stronghold for clerics. We also had included in these video series what an antagonist's stronghold may look like that the players are maybe infiltrating or overtaking in some way, shape, or form. A lot of what we've mentioned about clerics is, of course, true for that antagonist stronghold as well. But one of the things that immediately comes to mind is how the particular deity is in residence in that stronghold that gives that stronghold additional powers that the players have to overcome when they're trying to incorporate or overcome that cleric stronghold specifically.
Right. And I think that So there's a lot to cover here, and I want to start with a caveat of try to consider the antagonist as being of any alignment in any religion. There's so many, just as there are so many domains that the PC can be, there are just as many domains when it comes to an antagonist NPC as being the target of somebody you're trying to defeat or overthrow or whatever. And like you said, the deity is strongly associated with that, which simply empowers or reinforces that notion of what does this look like. And you can have a ton of fun with this, everywhere from the typical evil religious figurehead that is raising the dead and doing terrible things. But if you've got an evil or even a neutral party who is trying to overthrow a good religious figurehead, there may be a lot of reverse of that. So it may be something where it's so difficult to defeat this person because they're basically a life cleric who is they put out so much healing, they're just hard to kill or hard to overcome. So there's a variety of ways to address this, I think, and you can look at this from any number of ways when you're moving forward with developing that stronghold for an antagonist.
I'm trying to think of things specifically to add into that without getting into the weeds, because I was like, let's go ahead and break down every domain and what you might include in that stronghold based on the domain. But I want to trust in I want to trust in the viewers to be able to kind of look at those domains and imagine some of those things that they might include.
Yeah, and there's definitely some fun ones. Trickery domain, an evil war domain cleric. There are some really cool ways that you could look at an antagonist stronghold that the PC is seeking to overcome in order to either claim that stronghold for themselves or simply to overthrow because this is part of the campaign, whatever it is. But there are definitely some really cool options for the way that those domains could feed into a stronghold style quest or dungeon.
So I'm not sure what else to add with it without, again, going into the weeds. I'm trying to orient myself again.
Well, so one of the things that we talked about before was we had talked about potentially things like quest or lair actions. Sorry, my brain was halfway there. So lair actions, these again would be specific to a domain, and I think that this is an interesting option for both the NPC antagonist for something that you might have a life cleric who's going to overthrow some kind of evil cleric and try and dethrone them to remove it, but the evil cleric's lair actions are probably focused on something like the undead, so they're able to raise so many skeletons or zombies per round that are just filling the room, or they're able to release some kind of necrotic energy or this wail of terror that it causes a fear effect. Any number of options are huge, but when the life cleric takes over, that should be where the life cleric has their own lair actions within their own domain. And those would be things like this, initiative count 20, all of their allies heal, 1d8 or 1d4, or whatever it is that you think is appropriate. It may be something where they're able to remove a status effect of some kind. They're able to grant additional saving throws, provide bonuses on saving throws, things that would probably be more beneficial to their allies than necessarily negative to their enemies is generally where I would lean for lair actions when it comes to a life cleric in their own domain.
And thinking about things like a war domain cleric, like I'm considering stuff like maybe a bless spell, things that are going to give them bonuses to their attacks, to their defense, maybe giving them a haste, additional things that are going to give them additional options within the course of combat.
Yeah, and you could even lean into other ones that we'll talk about because we already talked about, for instance, the Barbarian Stronghold, where he has a horn that he might blow, or he has the archers that are on the parapets. The same thing is, we're going to have similar conversations when we get into things like the Fighter, and the War Domain can definitely pull off of things like that, in the same way that the Nature Cleric is going to be able to pull off things that we're going to discuss with the Druid video next week. Yeah.
Okay, anything else you'd like to talk about regarding Cleric Strongholds?
I don't think so. I think that versatility, they're huge. Like, they're probably they might be second to bards, but they're right up there in terms of the options available for cleric. It's pretty massive. So you can definitely have a bunch of fun with this and make it very customized to your specific PCs or NPCs to make them feel like they're unique.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I almost think they're some of the most versatile, which is probably why we see more offshoot side quests and campaigns that are built and tossed out there for people to pick up. So if you are looking for ideas on what you'd want to do, I mean, you could go search adventures built around temples and shrines that exist in every campaign.
Right, yeah. The temples, the shrines, that type of thing. It's a vast treasure trove of options available for building this type of stronghold.
All right, thank you guys so much for hanging out with us again. Make sure you hit that subscribe button, hit the little bell so you're notified about our next video, and we'll talk to you all next week.
Dungeon Brew.